afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CGD. I'm Nancy Lee, Director of the Sustainable Development Finance Program. I'm very pleased to see this relatively large group for an event on adaptation finance. I think it's having a moment this week. And you know, there have been many discussions about the serious and ongoing shortfall in adaptation finance for developing countries. That's not what this is about today. Today, our aim is to move beyond lamenting the shortfall to exploring the question of the best uses of adaptation finance. I mean, obviously, efficient use is critical when finance is short. But we have too little information at the moment about how finance is targeted now and should be targeted going forward by country, by sector, by different kinds of climate shocks, or different kinds of adaptation interventions. So that's what this is all about. Now, that's a big subject. There are all kinds of ways we could look at this. We're going to focus today on 5 issues that are certainly among the most pressing. First, how current MDB finance is allocated by country. Second, how energy access and climate resilience are interrelated. Third, how more adaptation finance can mobilize from the private sector. Fourth, how to make the investment case for more adaptation finance. And finally, how climate vulnerability and fragility are overlapping and mutually reinforcing. So that's a lot. But I think those are the right subjects for today. And we have a panel, which is, it would be hard to find a panel more qualified to discuss these issues, and I'm going to introduce them and bring them up to the podium in a minute. But before that conversation, I'd like to start us off with some CGD research on adaptation finance allocation. And the paper and blog are on our website, if what I say interests you in exploring it further. So MDBs are the largest public source of international adaptation finance for developing countries. In 2023, they provided $25 billion in finance, which is roughly a tenth of annual developing country needs. And the World Bank commits over half of that. So the World Bank is a key player. So in deciding what to research, we posed ourselves the question, does World Bank adaptation finance target the most vulnerable countries? Basically, simple question, but it's not, answering it was not simple. We decided to break it down into 5 dimensions. First of all, what's the best way to assess country climate vulnerability for this purpose? Second, what characteristics do those countries share? Third, do the most vulnerable countries actually get relatively more World Bank finance? By various measures of finance intensity. Is the finance intensity growing over time? And how is the finance allocated across different adaptation activities? So we had to start with defining what are the most vulnerable countries. So we used the Notre Dame Gain Index, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and we classified countries by 2 aspects of that index, exposure and adaptive capacity. So exposure measures physical changes to countries' land and other natural capital, water availability, heat levels, and food production. So very much focused on physical risks. Adaptation capacity, on the other hand, captures whether a country has the infrastructure and systems to respond effectively to climate change. World Bank infrastructure finance in the relevant sectors can therefore raise a country's adaptive capacity and thereby lower vulnerability. So I want to emphasize, adaptive capacity is not an overall governance measure, you know, budget capacity and institutional strength and policy quality. And that's not what we're measuring here. We're measuring particular kinds of investments in infrastructure and systems that make you more resilient to climate change. We thought that was the better way to define vulnerability in this context. So we used that score, that combined score for those 2 dimensions, to group our countries into high and low exposure groups, and then within the exposure groups, high and low adaptive capacity. We found that the most climate vulnerable countries are very poor. They're concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. They're reliant on IDA, the World Bank's window for the poorest countries. They're quite dependent on agriculture for a significant share of country output. They're much more fragile and conflict affected, and they're more burdened by weak governance using World Bank scores for governance. So their vulnerabilities very much reinforced each other. So we were testing the hypothesis: do countries with higher climate exposure and weaker adaptive capacity receive relatively more World Bank climate finance by various intensity measures? So let me just go very briefly through what we found. So again, there's 4 groups: high exposure, high adaptive capacity, that's capital E, capital A; high exposure, low adaptive capacity, capital E, lowercase a; and then low exposure countries with different capacities. So train your eye to the right side of the graph. You see that the countries with high exposure and low adaptive capacity, that's about 40 countries. Our country sample was 129 countries, and we went through 3,000 projects over a 10-year period. And when I say we, I mean actually Samuel Matthews here and James Reed, our co-authors, built these databases. So you can see, and this is for the entire period, the ratio of annual average adaptation finance per capita was $11 for countries with high adaptive capacity and high exposure, fell to $5 for countries with low adaptive capacity. And then we defined a category of the 7 countries in the world that are the most vulnerable. That is, they appear on the countries with the highest exposure, and they appear on the countries with the lowest adaptive capacity. All of those countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see that they receive very little adaptation finance. Then we took a look at the ratio of this finance to GDP to get a sense of the sort of fiscal space and the ratio of adaptation finance to overall output. And we found, in fact, that the World Bank's share is higher for countries with lower adaptive capacity. But if you look at what is necessary for those countries, so these are low-income countries, what we know is that they actually need more adaptation finance as a share of GDP than higher-income developing countries. Their costs are higher. And the estimates are that these countries need about 3 or 3.5% of GDP to meet their adaptation needs. So the World Bank at the moment, at least according to our numbers, finances about 10%, roughly 10% of their needs. But unfortunately, which is not unreasonable, but these are countries that don't have a lot of access to other external finance. Then we looked at changes over time. Obviously, adaptation finance has become more important over time. Countries have become more vulnerable, but also there's been a growing recognition of the importance. And you can see that the World Bank is really rapidly ramping up finance for these most at-risk countries, but they still receive a lot less than countries with higher adaptive capacity. So I'm comparing the 3 bars to the right of the slide. And then finally, we tried to take a look at what the money is spent for. And we looked at this vulnerable 7 countries, and we divided the activities into the categories that you see. As you might expect, a lot of the finance is spent on infrastructure, urban infrastructure, water infrastructure. But what we were surprised about is that there's relatively little money spent on climate resilient agriculture. So these are specific interventions to farmers, to pastoralists, so it's on food production and livestock to promote more resilient agriculture. And at least I would have expected that share to be higher. So what do we take from this very briefly? Once again, it comes back to IDA in a big way. That's where these countries get most of their finance, their adaptation finance. So the whole IDA replenishment process has been hugely important for this issue. We'll see how it ultimately comes out. And I would argue that these countries need to get from the World Bank a larger share of their overall adaptation needs, since they have so little access to other external finance, especially as aid is cut dramatically. Second, it's not enough just to have a bigger IDA. You need better access for these particular set of countries to those resources. Those are allocated by performance-based allocations. There are already some adjustments for climate vulnerability. We would suggest that there be a specific top-up for countries that are both fragile and climate vulnerable. Third, there needs to be more project development. World Bank needs finance for upstream development, because I'm sure there will be people who argue that the reason the adaptation finance levels are where they are is there aren't enough projects. So I would argue the climate financial intermediary funds need to step up here and do more support for project development in this set of countries. And finally, the area of climate resilient agriculture for these countries in particular is really important. So a greater effort from the World Bank in that area, and project development in that area would really yield high economic returns, but also social returns and reductions in fragility. Okay, so that's the short version of the paper, and I would like to now invite our panelists up to the dais so that we can have a conversation. Okay, well, I've really been looking forward for this conversation because you'll see that these are the people at the forefront of this endeavor. So just to introduce everybody, we have Agnes Dashowitz, who's the Chief Investment Officer of the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GAP. We have Carter Brandon, who's Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute. We have Camilla Rodriguez-Taylor, who's Climate Change Officer at IDB Invest. And we have Stefan Algat, who's Chief Climate Economist for the World Bank Group. So let's start first with Agnes, because I want to kind of pose a basic question, which is the relationship between energy access and climate resilience. You know, many see them as totally separate activities. Tell us a little bit about how you see the interaction, and particularly in the agricultural sector, which is so important in the economies that I was just talking about, particularly for women. And then how do you make the most catalytic decisions about where you put your finance?
So thank you, Nancy. Thank you to CGD for allowing us to speak here. It's a really exciting topic, and I've also been looking forward to speaking about this and to this great discussion. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, we were launched at Glasgow COP26. And we really have grown in those last 3-4 years from being a funder and of particular projects to really pivoting towards alliance building and solving global issues in the space of energy access and climate change. You know, we're only 3 years old, but so far through the projects that we've supported, we've been able to improve access to energy for 75 million people and businesses. We've also been able to help avoid 40 million tons of CO2. So we've had some very good successes. But what's most important is we learned from this, and we now are looking into how those various interventions can actually catalyze systemic impact, and how can we build coalition-driven partnerships that are really helping achieve that systemic impact. And the reason I really raise this is because this is very important when it comes to working on climate change, energy access, and in particular sectors like agriculture. This collaboration of different types of actors, for example, the collaboration of government who is planning and enacting policy, the collaboration of philanthropies who might be in the space for various reasons. Some of them, for example, are mainly focused on women and girls. Other philanthropic actors are focused on climate change. So bringing that together, plus bringing in the private sector. So private sector is incredibly important because I feel that that really brings in the sustainability of that systemic impact that we are really trying to catalyze together. So specifically in agriculture, the way we've been thinking about it is we have had some successes with a partnership, for example, that we have in Africa with the MasterCard Foundation. MasterCard Foundation really is coming at this, at the climate and energy access lens through improving the livelihoods of women and girls. So their main goal is how do we improve incomes? And we've been doing a lot of work on distributed renewable energy in rural areas in Africa, and often finding that the distributed energy grids that we've been helping fund or co-fund or finance and to develop and implement were not sustainable themselves because most of the communities were simply using this to, for example, power a light bulb. So we combined those approaches and started thinking about, well, how can we help, for example, introduce productive use equipment into those communities so that there is more energy demand, making those grids more sustainable, but also increasing incomes. And for that, we need not only the developers of the renewable grids and not only capacity building and the productive use equipment that may be delivered through a philanthropic support, we also need the government to really to be aligned in having that being part of their economic growth policy. Second, we need, for example, the MDBs, like the World Bank, to start incorporating things like this in their policy loans that they're giving to those countries, further driving this. And GAP can then really fill a role that's not there. So for example, if we discover that maybe the missing link in this entire ecosystem is the financing of the productive use equipment, maybe that's where we can intervene. So it really will depend, but what's most important is we're creating this ecosystem around what we call quadruple P, which is public, private, and philanthropic partnership. Because in this era of what some may perceive as being decreasing resources in the space, everyone is looking to do more together, but sometimes they're doing it in parallel, and their interests are not as aligned as they could be. So this is really where we step in to try to bring that in. And the role of MDBs is incredibly important in the space. Yep. They really are driving a lot of the finance and a lot of the policies. So we just need to make sure we're aligning them and making sure that the ecosystems that we're forming are, first of all, beneficial to those communities. So they're driving impact. They're driving economic growth, that we're using energy as the driver of that economic growth, which it often is. And third, that we're measuring the systemic impact of those partnerships and replicating what works. So that's really how I think about it. I think of it much more of an ecosystem than a kind of bespoke type of approach.
Got it. And so, you know, the time for silos really is past. It's just too costly, given the volume of both finance and the activities that have to come together. And I'm sure the communities you're working in are particularly affected by climate change in terms of their productivity. So, okay, so now let's let's take one of the Ps, the private sector part of the Ps, and I just wanted to move to Camilla. You know, the conventional wisdom is that the private sector is not going to finance adaptation activities. And yet, IDB Invest has written this, what I would describe as an authoritative white paper on scaling adaptation finance in the private sector. So first of all, can you debunk the myth that the private sector will never finance adaptation finance? And then tell us a little bit about the the very sort of innovative recommendations in the paper, internalizing cost savings from adaptation, measuring impact better, using instruments like outcome-based financing that can help crowd in the private sector.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. And yeah, IDB Invest is the private sector branch of the IDB group. And I would like to highlight first that it is true that private sector finance for adaptation is lagging behind. It is very hard to get projects for exclusive adaptation finance. The private sector wants to grow and expand, and most of the projects that we do are regarding this. And so it is difficult, but it's not because there's no opportunity, but it's because I think it's lagging behind because we haven't structured the value proposition in a way that can be readily accessible for the private sector. So some of the things that have stopped the private sector, or that we believe that are barriers for private sector to invest in adaptation finance so far, is that, for example, the revenue streams aren't quite clear. If we are comparing adaptation to mitigation, mitigation clearly has revenue streams, whereas adaptation doesn't. And when we talk about adaptation, then we are talking about what would it cost if we don't act, right? How many losses would we have? And those projections, those scenarios are difficult to model, and it's difficult to convince the private sector that that will happen, and when will that happen, right? How far along will that happen? So that return or that avoided loss takes a long time. And then the other part is that measuring the impact of adaptation, the benefits of adapting, is also complex. It's not greenhouse gas emissions, which are easy to measure. So we need to reframe this value proposition, and for that, we need to what we are trying to do is to internalize the value of those avoided losses and incorporate them into the models, the financial models of the projects that we finance, because it is true that the cost of inaction is greater than that upfront investment. So we need to convince the private sector that it is better to invest now than to have to adapt once the losses are greater or the impacts are greater. So in terms of impacts, what we have been doing is trying to move away from just measuring and tracking climate finance, adaptation finance in terms of dollars, and trying to measure impacts. And that is something that we've been doing together with the MDBs. Last COP, we launched an outcomes metrics paper that has a list of different adaptation indicators to track outcomes for adaptation impacts. One of these that we are also starting to track ourselves is what is the value of an asset that is adapted. Sometimes the design of an asset is just good design. It doesn't mean that it has to cost more. Maybe it's just orienting it in the right place, not choosing a place that is flooded, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to cost more, and the whole asset would be adapted or would be resilient. So, and we also want to push the fact that doing more adaptation finance has to be effective, right? So we want to have more impacts for each dollar that we invest in. So sometimes doing a very costly adaptation is not necessarily the best, right? We can do something that is a good design, lower cost, but has the effective outcomes that we are looking for. And so why is adaptation harder for the private sector? It's because we need to build a systemic change. It's not just one company adapting itself, but we have to have the enabling environment from the governments. It has to be systemic for the communities that are surrounding and for the collaboration between other private sectors in the value chain. And this takes time, and we need new skills and more information. So for example, I mentioned modeling scenarios and being able to predict or forecast what can those potential losses be, and help the private sector analyze and know what their climate risk is and what the vulnerability is, not only of themselves, but of their value chain. And this is something that we've been trying to do with the financial intermediaries, helping them assess their own risk, so then that they can not only identify who of their clients, their portfolio sectors is vulnerable, but identify adaptation measures that then they can build into credit lines for adaptation. And this is really important because at IDB Invest we work with big companies, but we also need to be targeting the SMEs and smaller companies. So through our financial intermediaries, that's how we get there. And then we need a lot of public-private coordination. So for example, when we finance infrastructure projects, many of these infrastructure projects were won in public bids, where the requirements for the public bids are set by governments. And if those requirements don't include climate resilience, then most likely those projects might not have those specifications in their design. And once they come to us, it's really hard for us to tell them to modify the project because it might be more costly. So we need to work with the public sector in order for them to require resilient buildings, resilient infrastructure, and I liked the 4 Ps because definitely philanthropy and other types of partnerships are really important. What have we been doing in terms of innovative finance that you were asking about? Well, we need longer-term financing than what we already have, and we are looking to set outcome-based models based on KPIs and these impact metrics, and be able to recognize the co-benefits of adaptation in terms of water management, also in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of increased jobs, securities, food security, and to design better instruments for this purpose. So we are doing 5 things in that term. Upstream support, being able to do feasibility studies, climate risk assessments, provide advisory services before we provide a loan so that we can help the clients develop the business case for the adaptation and be able to design an adapted project. And then sometimes we can't do this before the loan, and so we offer an advisory service that does these feasibility studies. And if they are feasible, then we have like an uncommitted credit line. So we give them a credit line or a loan, and then we have an uncommitted tranche that can be unlocked if the feasibility study is positive. Because if we have to wait for the feasibility study to be done, then maybe they go with another bank, or or they don't want to incorporate that. So that's a good way. And we have been using a climate resilient debt clause for several years now, specifically for agriculture. This is a deferral of principal, which is helpful in terms of when there's El Niño, La Niña, or some specific climate event, and including blended finance for adaptation milestones. We've done that in 4 Points Hotel in Guyana, and for buildings especially, we have a lot of incentives for EDGE or LEED certifications that are mainly looking at mitigation. But if we can provide blended finance for milestones that are related to adaptation, water management, and resilient design, then we see that as a win. And well, sustainability-linked loans are another kind of outcome-based finance that is helpful. So I leave it at that, and happy to answer more questions.
And I'm going to ask you this question, maybe Stefan, when we come to you, you can answer it. Do you lower explicitly lower the cost of capital for resilience investments by the private sector? In other words, that's internalizing the benefits of reducing the risk. Is that your outcomes-based finance? You lower the. I'm actually asking both of you. You might as well answer. Do you provide a discount, an interest?
So it's a blended finance portion that has like better terms.
Yeah.
It has a lower rate, and it also can have like a longer term.
Okay.
But that's only for that blended finance. And so if you get maybe a big loan, this would be a small percentage of the blended finance, and it is tied to those milestones.
Okay. Okay. Well, actually, let me change the order then, but I'm going to come back to Carter on this. What Carter calls the triple dividend, which is this whole question of how you internalize this. But Stefan, why don't you talk a little bit about the instruments the World Bank is using, but in particular, if you could focus on this whole question of the intersection between fragility and climate vulnerability. Very hard to work in these contexts and develop projects. So really give us a sense of actually what would make it easier for the World Bank to ramp up finance in those contexts. I mentioned a few things with respect to IDA and having the financial intermediary funds operate more, but what do you think would make it easier?
And first, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you very much for the study. I think we really welcome this kind of like focus on where the money is going, and it's really, really useful to have people looking at that through different angles. So I think this is very, very welcome. And the first thing I wanted to say is that we agree with the key findings of the study, right? I think we agree on the fact that vulnerability is particularly extreme in some contexts and in low capacity, fragile, low income environments. We agree that it's very difficult to bring adaptation finance to those places and more generally to build resilience in those places. And we appreciate also the link with IDA and the development finance in general that you're making in the study. And maybe I'll just use a little detour to just in a few minutes just to tell you how we see the adaptation challenge because I think it's very relevant to think about this link. The first thing that we see is we need to be successful at adaptation and resilience, which means protecting people against those impacts. We need more rapid development. We need more development. We need more poverty reduction. If people are living in extreme poverty, even if we do adaptation and resilience projects, they will be extremely vulnerable. So anything we do should not be at the expense of development and poverty reduction, otherwise it's a losing deal. And so it really means that we have to think about what we're doing in terms of adaptation and resilience in that context of the development objective. The second thing is that we need better development in the sense that today there are a lot of development patterns that are creating risks instead of reducing them. And an example that maybe some of you have heard me talk about it already is today cities in the world are growing faster in flood zones than in safe areas. So because development is not going in the right way, not only we're not building resilience as much as we could, but we're also creating risks that tomorrow will be a headache to fix. And so when we look at these better development components, it's a lot about the systems, right? If cities are growing in flood zones, not because people like it, just because they don't have the data, they don't have the modeling capacity, or when they have all of that, they don't have a capacity to drive urbanization in the right places because of land tenure is not there, because there is a lot of informal settlements. So those development issues that we see today are really linked to basic systems that are absent. And I agree very much with what you said on the private sector. One of the reasons why the private sector is not doing the job, even though they have all of the incentives in the world to invest in resilient things, it's largely because they are lacking those systems. And for us, when we invest in those sectors, then there is an additional cost because the systems don't exist. So you need each project to do its own risk assessments and its own data collection, and it makes everything more costly and more complicated. So it justifies the use of blended finance to help the private sector to do that. But over the long run, what you would want is to have the systems in place so that the private sector can do it without blended concessionality included. And so faster development, better development, and the last bucket is places that we call hotspots, where this is sort of an existential issue, right? And I think a lot of the places that you highlight in your slides where there is little money going are places in that situation, like in the Sahel or in the Horn of Africa, places where if you don't fix the resilience challenge, you won't fix the development challenge. And one reason why it's so difficult is because of the lack of those systems to invest. And so if there is one thing that I think would be important to discuss on your study is how much can we invest more in those places in a way that's still efficient and using those resources well. So we have this report called Closing the Gap that was looking exactly at your question on the fragility and investment in adaptation. And the numbers is that the average amount invested in adaptation is $7 per capita. In FCV, it's 5, and in high-intensity conflict, it's 2.7. So you see very well that the places where people we see are the most vulnerable are places where we invest less. But I think it has to be seen in the context of how difficult it is to do it. And we have a very tight environment in terms of funding, so efficiency is also something that is really, really important. And this space is full of very hard trade-offs, but I don't think we can only look at those numbers and say we need to move the money in those places. I think we need much more of a bottom-up approach to identify high returns interventions in those places. And that's one thing that we're trying to do with country analytics. So we're doing those country climate and development reports in all countries. And at the beginning, it was interesting. People were saying, why are you doing those reports in places like Yemen or, Sudan, or places in conflict with very high priority linked to humanitarian needs? And I think if you read those reports, you will see that they are different from the China one, very different. But they still highlight some very high return interventions that are possible in a conflict or fragile contexts. And I think this is how we should be starting, right? In each of the country, trying to identify those high returns interventions and give them priority. Maybe more than with a blanket solution that would just increase an envelope, even in places where actually we don't have those opportunities. So I don't want to be much longer so that we can discuss, but the last point I wanted to make is we have also a big challenge within countries. In many places, if you arrived and apply the basic economic standards to define your priorities for disaster risk management, for instance, what you see as priorities are rich places. And that's because we're using the losses in terms of economic losses, in terms of assets. And rich people have assets that poor people don't. And so I think we have a challenge within countries that we want efficiency. So we need analytics to highlight the high returns interventions. If we do just that, we will intervene only in rich places. And so we need to balance the need to be efficient with the need to be just and to be fair and to take into account the vulnerability of those populations within countries. And that is a big challenge, but we have been working on different tools to try to do that, to make sure, for instance, we can flag countries that the benefits of their intervention to reduce risks may be very high in rich places if you count avoided asset losses, but you can also count the number of people who will not fall in poverty for different interventions. And then you see the ranking of your interventions will just completely flip. And you'll find some places where every dollar is avoiding a larger number of people from preventing them from falling in poverty. And so that's still efficiency because we're still ranking interventions, we're still going for the better interventions with higher results, but the results are not measured in economic terms, but in the number of people falling in poverty. So let me stop here, but I'm happy to also come back to this within country challenge because the what you mentioned on the outcome-based metrics, what we're doing with the World Bank Group scorecard is really trying to also go within countries so that we can report on results not only at the country level, but in a much more granular manner so that we can be more accountable on results. So you can do more granular studies next year maybe, but also that for us that we can target our interventions toward where we have the most results.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point that you know, if you're trying to restore the productivity of assets or extract greater returns of assets, you go where the assets are, which maybe also relates to the, you know, another finding that we found a little surprising, which is that a lot of the infrastructure that's being built in these very agriculture-dependent economies, a lot of the finance is going actually to urban centers in those countries, which we were a little surprised that they don't go to more rural areas, but that is the most, you know, that's where the most vulnerable infrastructure already is, I would think.
But hopefully this vision of vulnerability at the household level, which is how our scorecard indicator on risk is based on household surveys. So we're really looking at the family as the level of analysis. Hopefully it will help us target that better.
Yeah.
And on that, I think you had the transition all found for Carter, because I thought he was going before me, so I thought all the triple dividend story would have been made already.
Set me up perfectly.
But it's exactly the right setup. So Carter.
So yes, and this was all about this value proposition that Camilla was talking about. Tell us about the triple dividend, you know, what it is, and how it makes the case for these adaptation investments where the benefits are down the road. And then also sort of say, you've been thinking about this a while and wrote about it a while ago. Tell us whether you think progress is being made in people sort of paying attention to the triple dividend, quantifying it, and incorporating it in their investment decisions.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us. Thanks to the panel, and good to be here. Stefan did a blog, I don't know, it was even last week, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the triple dividend. So yes, we've kicked this around for a while. But about 6-9 months ago, the Gates Foundation came to WRI. By the way, I used to be at the World Bank, but I've been at WRI 6 years. But Gates Foundation asked us to look at the question of how do we strengthen the investment case for adaptation. So we took that challenge to be what I will call bottom up. What are good investments and what works and what's the rate of return? We told Gates Foundation, don't use the expression best buys. It doesn't fit everywhere. It's too driven by the local context. And now they're talking about big bets. We said, no, don't talk about bets. There's a lot of certainty here. Anyway, we actually have drilled down. So actually, one of my co-authors is here, Rushi Agarwal. But let me tell you quickly about the triple dividends. Then I'll tell you quickly about what we've done with it. And then if we have time, I'll revisit quickly on agriculture.
Okay.
Okay.
We have time.
Triple dividends, very quickly, is the idea. It uses cost-benefit analysis, by the way, so the broader methodology is well known, even if not always well applied. It's pretty well applied at the World Bank, but some people say not as good as, say, 20, 25 years ago. It's pretty well applied at other MDBs. It's not really used so much at the what's called the climate finance agencies like Green Climate Fund or GEF. But what we did was we looked at projects that had adaptation as an objective. Not necessarily the primary objective, but explicitly an objective. So we open up 100% to the development agenda of the World Bank and other MDBs. The first of the triple dividends is what are the avoided losses, which we've heard all about already with the panel. The second dividend is what are the induced development benefits associated with the risk of reducing the overall risk in the economy, the overall cost of doing business, the cost of capital, the maybe cost of insurance if it's an industrial setting. But what are the induced benefits that you get anyway, even if you don't have that storm. And then the third triple dividend would be, Stefan sort of hinted at it, the social or environmental benefits, typically the externalities, typically the non-market benefits. The social would be very strong on health projects or disaster risk management, given community well-being. The environmental benefits are very strong, sometimes in agriculture, very strong on forestry, but it would include even carbon emissions reductions on energy projects, for example. So we have these three dividends. And then we looked at 320 projects from the last 10 years, 2014, 2024, and looked at what are the dividends, what are the rates of return, what does it tell us? First off, high returns. Boom. These projects, now this is not a distributed sample of good and bad project ideas. These are all projects that were approved and funded. So somebody decided they were good projects, so no surprise. But the rates of return in the what they call project appraisals was super high, average 27%, something like that. 27 is off the charts compared to typically you want 10 or 12. Second, we found that the dividends of these projects were pretty evenly split across avoided losses, induced development, and the social environmental. Pretty evenly split. What does that tell you? First of all, well, these are development projects. It tells you good adaptation is good development. It tells you that we're not really looking at, or we probably don't even want, standalone adaptation projects. We want good development that is resilient. It has the fundamental outcomes of development. We also found that with a high rate of return of 27%, if 2/3 of those benefits are in dividends 2 and 3, 2/3 of 27 is 18, already very high return even without the avoided losses. So these are good development projects already. We also found that we'll make the data public too when we publish in about a month. We also found that the dividends are not always valued very well. Again, cost-benefit analysis will give you methodologies for valuing all of these dividends. But when you get at the project level, let's say an agriculture project in Ethiopia or a health project in Brazil, they will list pretty carefully in the project documents what the benefits are, which is how we can sort of look at what the project is trying to accomplish. But they wouldn't necessarily value it. So the valuing of avoided losses, which gets into probability and it gets into scenarios. Well, what's your climate scenario that would determine the probability of the storm? Well, it depends on global assumptions, et cetera. Difficult to do, so it's not often done. So even these high rates of return are pretty low because a lot of the benefits articulated in the project are not actually valued. And so we can sort of confidently say that these estimated returns are low, but I can also say those estimated returns are ex ante. Everybody who looks at what we do says what we really want is to go back and, 7, 10 years later and say, is this even remotely accurate? Of course, we'd like to do that too. So it's another study you can do in 5 years' time. Okay, one thing we found also, which you would find of interest, there is a greater mitigation co-benefit in adaptation projects than we ever expected, almost high 40%, because it has to do with efficiency, because it has to do with nature, because it has to do with reducing, carbon sequestration in nature and emissions reduction maybe in infrastructure, which I don't know for sure that would ever open a financing channel for adaptation projects, but it could if we have sort of more mature and functioning carbon markets. So that was a good finding. Let me loop around quickly on agriculture. The avoided losses in agriculture were, returns on adaptation investments in agriculture were pretty high. Yeah. Very high for health, disaster risk management, and what we divided agriculture into sustainable agriculture and forestry and landscape scale. The forestry and landscape scale had even higher rates of return than agriculture. But if you talk about a pecking order, both forestry, landscape, and agriculture was very high, followed by some of the infrastructure in cities. What struck us oddly was water was quite low, both water supply and sanitation, and separately watershed management and flood management, partly because they didn't value the avoided losses. But anyway, but agriculture's high, but it had relatively low avoided losses. Again, no surprise to you, these are development projects. The benefits of those agricultural investments were super high. No surprise, so then we get into the implementation question. Why aren't they doing more of it, right?
Yeah.
But that's what we found. In terms of the private sector, where's the money as opposed to the environmental benefits or the avoided losses, which are savings per se? But where's the money? It's in the second dividend. And so you can, by looking at project design, think about at least where's the return on investment in terms of increased output, increased jobs, investments in supply chains, for example, with return on those investments. So it gives you, by teasing out these dividends, it gives you a place to start, which I find quite interesting. And then the last point on agriculture was when you look across water, agriculture, forestry, maybe even infrastructure, if it has to do with hydro or things, it gets very complicated, but that complexity is part of the rural space. And those, in fact, happen to be projects that seem to have pretty high returns. So we don't want to shy away from the complexity or well, this gets to the silo issue. We do want to break down the silos because nature has lots of benefits, and watersheds have a lot of benefits. And it could be agriculture, it could be people, it could be water supply, it could be biodiversity, it could be agriculture, the services to agriculture. So that's a real opportunity. I think that's kind of what I do. I do want to flag one more thing on private sector. Maybe, Camilla, you know what's it called? Gary. It's a kind of a coalition of adaptation investment. I forget what Gary stands for. Do you remember?
The acronym tests your TAF. No, I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know what the G is. Group or something. I don't know. Global Adaptation and Resilience Initiative. Right. So they did surveys of corporations to see who's investing in adaptation. And agriculture was pretty high on the list because of this induced value added. But they divided how they looked at adaptation into two columns. One was climate intelligence, where for the private sector, there's money and data and information in satellite imagery and monitoring and reporting. So that was one thing. And then in terms of the actual induced investment in agriculture. But after agriculture, the sectors they really flagged were water supply and buildings, and building technology, and then after that, a little bit infrastructure. But, so there are examples, and I'll share it with you because I think it's a good market test of what's actually happening.
That's excellent, and I have a huge number of questions, but I'm going to restrain myself because I'm going to come to the audience in a few minutes. It's really good news that you actually have less of a trade-off between mitigation and adaptation than people keep talking about trade-offs between development and climate and between adaptation and mitigation. But if you find that the projects that are adaptation focused are producing mitigation, that's very good news. And also the fact that the agriculture projects have high returns, even if you don't incorporate it in avoided losses, which is hard. So actually, before I want to go back to all of the panelists with the same questions, but I wanted to go back to Camilla and Stefan, if you're interested. Why isn't there more private sector interest in agriculture investments, which have returns, because you essentially these are investments that raise productivity, which has been damaged by climate change? Is it because lots of these countries have lots of smallholder farmers, and they're unproductive anyway, and it's very hard to make them more productive with or without climate change? Or what's the issue?
So I can start. I work particularly with agriculture, with the agribusiness sector and tourism sector in IDB Invest. And from my understanding, they don't call it adaptation, but they're still doing it, right? And they're very sophisticated. We have clients that are doing all kinds of things related to climate monitoring systems, weather forecasting stations that they have in their lands. They're doing, for example, blueberry production company that is using, what do you call these, like pots, instead of putting the blueberries on the ground so that they can do better water efficiency. They're using sensors to track the use of water and are doing projections for reservoirs of water and better pest control with biocontrol and biological agents. I see the agriculture sector or the agribusinesses as being one of the most concerned about climate change. It's just that they're not calling it climate change. But they are definitely the clients with whom we don't have to convince them that the climate is changing, and they see the direct relationship to productivity. Not as much maybe in other kinds of sectors, but I think in agriculture it's there, and maybe the difference can be with the segments between, as you mentioned, the smallholder farmers and the larger farmers. And so when we work with companies that have smallholder farmers in their supply chain, it is them as our anchor company that through technical assistance can help their supply chain improve their resilience, because it's those smallholder farmers that don't have access to technology and are not investing necessarily. But we are seeing a lot of uptake. It's our sector where adaptation is it's easiest for us.
Got it.
But I would even expand that to other sectors, right? So we did a few months ago a book called Raising to the Challenge that had a set of case studies of interventions. And we had 30 examples of private sector interventions on adaptation and resilience. And I think none of them were labeled resilience. They were labeled efficiency. When they were labeled resilience, it was more thinking about supply chain issues than climate or disaster per se. A lot were framed as sustainability, especially in the water field. And it's really interesting that we keep comparing the data we have on the flow of private finance toward adaptation and resilience to the needs, but the scope of the assessments are completely different. I mean, every time we build a new factory, someone builds a new factory with the right standards and the right resilience, if there is a 5% additional cost, nobody's recording that. It's nowhere. Same thing for all of the buildings and houses built across the world. So there is a lot happening already, in part thanks to the awareness that now everybody knows about climate change. And I think it has changed completely in the last 20 years. But that data doesn't exist. We don't know. And so we're comparing the needs. When we assess the needs, we look at the incremental costs when we build factories and buildings. But when we're doing it right, we don't measure it. So maybe we can also be a little bit optimistic here and saying there is probably much more happening that we realize. And that's in part because of all of those conversations, the awareness, and also all of the investment in the systems. That you find risk data available everywhere now much more easily than 5 years ago. So agriculture is a bit specific. We have what we call the resilience rating system, where we're trying to do the assessment that Carter described. We're looking at showing that the project will be a good project, even in the bad scenarios in terms of climate and disasters. And it was really interesting when we piloted it. We did it on $3 billion of IDA project. In agriculture, it takes 10 times the time to compare with other projects, just because it's 16 different components, and every one are very small, and they all interact, and if you're missing one, you're just missing the whole point. So we see the complexity, and that's, I think, something that we should really think of, because you might have heard Ajay Banga, our president, talk about scale quite a lot. And so I think we have this challenge that we want scale, we want to do faster, bigger, having a bigger impact that we can measure. And there is a question of, in those contexts where the needs are the highest, but also the needs to tailor intervention are the highest, how do we manage this trade-off between going to scale and being tailored to the context? Yeah. I think we have examples of that. On methane in rice production, for instance, we managed to go to scale very quickly in a few years by replicating things that we knew worked, but it was on one production for one objectives. I think we have a challenge in not getting lost in the complexities of those projects, so that we can also be efficient in going to scale and have a real impact, and not just very well designed pilot project that will be nice to see, but without the scale that we need. We estimated 1.2 billion people are exposed and don't have the most basic tools to manage risks. So we cannot really afford to lose ourselves in the complexity also. So there's no clear, obvious solution for that, but we have to consider the two sides of the coin.
Yeah. You know,
Can I add to this?
Sure.
Yeah, just really quickly, because I think this is a really important point. From an investor point of view, agriculture is probably one of the most complex sectors to invest in. Rabobank, which is an agriculture-focused bank, told me that when they go into places like Africa, what they actually do is they train agriculture agents how to make loans, not loan agents how to understand agriculture. Because the agriculture agent will understand a lot more quickly when there is a crisis coming, and will try to restructure that loan, as opposed to the loan officer who's going to wait for the first payment not to come in, right? I think that's an incredibly important nuance that I think investors just don't want to invest time in, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really interesting. And you know, one thing this conversation makes very clear to me is that you cannot measure success by the volume of adaptation finance or the share of adaptation finance, which is the way, to date, everybody's been focused. Because, you know, first of all, I don't know, the people who have to actually tag adaptation finance and add it all up and then, you know, assess what the share of adaptation finance, I feel sorry for them, because it's, you know, all of this suggests that development and adaptation are, and productivity, and also household income are all intertwined. And it just seems to me it's a really hard task to just say, but this much is adaptation. So really has to be more of a focus on the actual outcomes that as the measure of success. So.
But it's also nice because it's a positive development story, right?
Yes.
It's not just a defensive thing, like you have losses and you want to reduce them. It's much easier to sell a kind of triple dividend story like Carter was putting it. Like, the goal is to have this resilient long-term development. This requires resilience, but what we're trying to achieve is successful development and poverty eradication. It's not just reducing losses.
Yeah.
So then we might need to report the share of finance going here and there. But I think the narrative should be a development-focused narrative and not just a defensive adaptation narrative.
Yeah, and I mean, that's also very consistent with the findings of our study, which is that you need to build countries' basic infrastructure capacity in order to be able to invest in adaptation. So, okay, so just one last question to all of you, and then I'm going to turn to the audience, which, so you're all involved in assessing where to put finance, where it's most productive, and where it has the greatest impact. We're in a world where the overall volume, I don't need to even mention the overall constraints in public finance for anything related to development these days. So just, very briefly, if each of you would say, from your work or your research, where would you put finance for the maximum impact if you're, in a world of scarce finance. So let's do it reverse, Carter.
Okay. I want to tell a quick story. So probably my least favorite study ever at the World Bank, I was a reviewer, was when they were looking at small farmers, marginal farmers in the Sahel, and saying, can we reduce the risk and maintain their level of income given whatever the climate impacts were being modeled, droughts and that sort of thing. And the conclusion was, yes. If we do education, finance, agricultural research, and diverse cropping, and a little bit of income diversification, and credit, and I don't know, something else, then we can overcome the impacts of climate change. And my response as a reviewer was, first of all, that'll never happen. We never get everything right in these complicated areas. But more importantly, your goal is to keep the poorest farmers on the planet at the same level of income. That's what you're trying to do. So that's, to me, was sort of an example of focusing on the risk and the loss and not focusing on the development objective and the outcome. Hopefully, that was a few years ago. Where would I put the money? Well, we've certainly talked about development, so I don't want to rehash that. But and in agriculture, to me, I was the yield gap is, to me, where I always go. It's not the gates, we need the new technology. No, we kind of know a lot of what to do. Let's just see if we can, what that takes. But a flip side of that is the real likelihood that natural capital or the survivability in marginal lands is not there. And that migration, call it managed retreat or something, migration shouldn't always be thought of as a problem, but it can also be part of a solution. And the more you anticipate, prepare, educate, give rights, give resources, whatever. I don't know. So I'm not saying that's a priority for money, but I think it's part of the solution set that we should bring that we haven't done so yet. That's, in the ag sector.
Yeah, no, that's a point of view that's very consistent with colleagues here at the Center for Global Development. Migration is a way to shift people from an environment that it's going to be very hard to raise their productivity to an environment where their productivity can be much harder, and you're pointing to a natural capital deficit that just can't be fixed. Of course, maybe some of the gates people would say, we just need more innovation and we'll find,
If you can wait 20 years, yeah.
We'll find some variety of, grain that can grow with almost no, if it rains once a year. But I think that's a very reasonable point. What's your, Agnes,
I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I think I kind of have three points where I would put my money. First of all, I would definitely strengthen local institutions, right? I think if we want to have this climate resilience, adaptation, mitigation, really be scaled up, we have to have not only the buy-in of the local institutions, but those institutions must have the capacity to deliver. So I think that's very important. The second one is really and going back to the private sector, we're going to need private sector. So I would use money to really de-risk early stage investment. And that's not necessarily just, building a capital stack where foundations or philanthropy or DFIs are in the junior positions. It's also about project preparation. I think there's a lot of need to really to support project development because a lot of private sector and DFIs will not take, for example, construction risk. So it's important to kind of bring projects to a place where these larger funders can engage. And then the last thing I would say is that, this is what I've been talking about earlier. I would try to invest in the small A, right? So I think buildings are important and all of that is really, infrastructure is really important, but we do have technology to help local communities with cooling, right? So that they can actually, so their crops are not wasted and they can sell them. As climate changes, we do need to invest in those types of well-known technologies to enable the communities that can to really be resilient and continue not only to just keep their income, but to increase their income over time. So I think that those are kind of 3 areas where I would place
Just
it.
give us one example of an institution that you would, kind of institution that you.
I think, for example, in Ethiopia, the Agricultural Transformation Institute, right? I think that I was around, so I'm going to age myself, when they were set up in Ethiopia. It was quite a bit. And they were really meant to look at regulatory changes that would enable more investment coming in into Ethiopia. But they've been involved in a lot of things. For example, we're working with them now in Ethiopia to help build irrigation systems, to help communities.
So they're just a key building block in that
Exactly.
part of the world. Yeah.
To kill the local institutions that are really addressing this issue and enable them to do it over time on their own and continue building that.
Got it. What's your short list?
Well, I think if we're talking about adaptation, we need to talk about beneficiaries. And so, of course, we need to target the most vulnerable. And that's where adaptation finance should go, mainly to rural areas, to fragile, critical contexts, informal urban settlements. That's something that we don't do at IDB Invest, but those are our areas. And of course, agriculture is very close to my heart. I've been working on that for a very long time, and it's a sector that we're seeing a lot of migration of like the young generations that don't want to stay in the farms anymore, and there are growing risks of food insecurity. And so I think it's a sector that is critical for our lives, and we should be investing there to attract more job creation and food security in the future. So I also think the impact argument is really important. So finding those projects or areas where we can align the adaptation finance with impact, and not only looking at the climate resilience, but also looking at like gender equity and health, water access, food security, and having the multiple dividends. Yeah.
Got it. Stefan.
So a lot has been said already, but the way I see it, first, if we have even less resources than in the past, then efficiency becomes critical. And so I would say the first thing is every dollar that gets invested in development should not be wasted because it's built in the wrong place or with the wrong technology or with the wrong solutions. And so all of the screening that we're doing to make sure all of the investments are resilient and fit for purpose become even more important. And if we want to do that in an efficient way, we need all of those systems. So I would invest in those systems. I don't know who in the room finds construction norms super exciting. Okay, I'm the only one. They are super exciting in many construction norms. So instead of having every time you build something, I have one here. Instead of having every time you build something, you have to think about the cost-benefit analysis to design it well. You can do it once for a country, have a map, and when you build something, you just look at the map, and this is what you build. And that reduces the transaction costs for all of the projects, but you need to put money upfront on something that is not very sexy and exciting, so it's very difficult to find the energy to do that. But those systems, the multiplier effect on all of the projects will be enormous. So I think this is where a lot of the money should go. And finally, I mentioned the hotspot at the beginning. There are those places where people are really, really in danger now, and the money should go there. But I want to say the money should go there. The money might not even be labeled climate adaptation. So we're doing this energy access project in Africa, M300. You might have heard of it. Only a tiny fraction of that will count as adaptation finance. But if you're in those places, access to electricity is absolutely critical to be able to cope with higher temperatures. And so I think there is also this idea that we need to help the most vulnerable, and then how we label things is a secondary problem. What we want is to have a good impact on those people.
Yeah.
So maybe a spatial focus on high vulnerability places more than deciding upfront about the priorities in terms of sectors. Let's start with the places and look at the priorities of those places and invest in that.
Yeah, and measure by whatever reduced vulnerability outcome you're going for, as opposed to how much finance you put into adaptation versus development versus mitigate or energy access.
May
Okay.
I add something there?
Yeah, sure.
I think from MDBs, it is very, like, our money is just like a drop of water in the ocean. So we really need to target like transformational systemic changes and stop financing business as usual and really try to push for those like innovative systemic changes, because to prove a case that then can be scaled up. And I think that's our biggest challenge, to be able to find those projects and take the risk of doing that.
Yeah, the sort of overall systemic impact or market impact. I would really agree with that. Okay, we have a few minutes left, and I hope you all have been thinking about questions you want to raise.
Yes.
So let's maybe we should go from this side to this side. So the lady here in the second to last row, let's start with her. Maybe we could take 3 questions first, and then.
Thank you. My name is Sylvia. I'm from the Climate Hub of BRAC, BRAC International. So we at BRAC, we're trying to work with women smallholder farmers, recognizing not only that agriculture is very sensitive to climate change, but the return of investment on this sector is extremely high, particularly in smallholder farmers. I was actually reviewing many of the World Bank CCDRs and finding that agriculture under different emission scenarios in the future is so devastating in terms of how impacts can keep occurring, making the investments so important. So my question is related to I'd love to know your views that if these important investments are needed to be made, what would you suggest as standardized frameworks, or I won't use the word metrics, but to see how we can quantify these benefits on adaptation so that we have more and enhanced adaptation finance in these sectors, especially if we want to have like-minded partners, including the private sectors, to come and invest in these sectors. Thank you.
Yeah, that's sort of the infrastructure that you were talking about, ways to measure the benefits. Okay, we'll take 2 more over on this side. Okay, this lady with the striped top, and then Stephanie.
Hi, I'm not going to stand just because I'm holding a bunch of stuff. But I guess my question is sort of right here. I assume you're, by the way, I'm Kelly Fink. I'm formerly U.S. government. I assume right here you're generally preaching to the choir, right? And I think that there's really, really great data that you talked about in the WRI report. And especially with the whole idea of adaptation finance sort of being integrated across all types of sectors and all types of programs. But how do you solve the problem of sort of making everybody think like a farmer, right? I mean, farmers have always, you made the point that farmers are already thinking about this. They're not calling it adaptation, but they're already doing it. But I can see the challenge on the public sector side of getting people who focus on education to think about climate, and to get people who are focused on democracy to think about climate. And it sounds like that's the same problem on the private sector side, getting them to think about the benefits of adaptation as sort of inherent in everything that they do. So what do we do to get everybody else to think like a farmer and start doing this as just a matter of practice?
Great. Okay, one more, and then we'll come to this side. Steph.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh, I thought Stephanie.
Go ahead.
Then 2 quick questions.
Okay, well, I was going to ask 3 questions. I will only ask 1. My name is Arend Kouwenaar. I'm a macroeconomic advisor in the Ministry of Finance in Rwanda. I do a lot of capacity building, including climate modeling, projection, and everything. My question is about how to make adaptation profitable for the private sector. I think some of you tried to answer that question, but I didn't really get a clear answer. I think some of you explained the social benefits of all these investments, the damage avoided, the losses avoided, and everything. But it's not marketable. It's not possible to price it. So I see basically adaptation is a public good. You will probably need to subsidize it. either development aid or the governments themselves need to subsidize the public goods they want to provide in order to build a more resilient capital. But maybe there's another way. Maybe you alluded to other ways to make it profitable. Unlike, I think as some of you said, mitigation or anything green energy, that is possible in principle to let the market take care of it. In fact, we heard the Minister of Budget of Ivory Coast saying 2 days ago here in the same place, well, he needed concessional financing to make the solar panels profitable. Maybe that was not the right way, the right use of concessional financing or of subsidies. Maybe everything should be put into adaptation and let, for green energy, mitigation, the market take care of it. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, last question on this side. It's I'm Stephanie Siegel, I'm non-resident here at CGD. It's kind of a meta question, but we've heard now in the course of this week senior officials from the US raising questions about these institutions focusing on climate as distinct from development or as distinct from macro stability. And from what I've heard you say on the panel, it's really kind of baked into the cake, right? It's development, it's climate resilient development, but it's development. And so I'm wondering about the feasibility of doing away with climate targets and not really drawing attention to the climate component so much as resilient development and stability that takes into account climate impacts. Is it reasonable to think that we could actually move away from specific climate targets and in the course of doing so kind of take the bullseye off of projects that are quote unquote
climate finance targets?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
got it. Okay, good questions. So why don't we, all right, we've got questions on this side. Why don't, each of you answer any of the questions that you wish.
I can speak a little bit about climate finance, right? Because, I mean, previously I was at DFC, where we did a lot of climate finance. And it was actually difficult to figure out what was climate finance, what was not. Yeah. Because a lot of what we did touched on climate, right? So we tried to use the UN definition, and that was too constraining. And, so I do think that the private sector at this point has recognized that climate is a risk, that climate change is a risk that they need to address. And as long as there are projects that are actually addressing that risk, I feel that the private sector is willing to finance them. They have to have a revenue stream, right? That's the number one thing to get private financing in. They have to have a revenue stream. A lot of adaptation projects, when you think of the big A, it's difficult to see that. Like a seawall, how are you going to have a revenue stream from that, right? That's the most extreme example. But basically, people have started looking at, for example, when you're building a highway, making it a little bit more expensive but it's actually resilient to floods, right? And actually, they have been able to recover this type of financing through tolls or whatever. So there are ways of doing it. It's just it's just difficult. So I do think that climate finance has just become finance because everyone needs to deal with the fact that wherever they are, climate is changing, whether they agree on the cause of that or not.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah,
maybe I can build on that. I mean, I think that there are two big categories, right? There is a category of things where we're doing something and we want to make it more adapted or more resilient. In most cases, the additional cost is like 3 to 5%. And in most cases, the reduction in OPEX and repair costs pays for itself. And so these we can get implemented by the private sector with the right information. So you need the system so that the benefit is visible and the right regulation, especially in the financial sector, in terms of transparency, reporting, and the assessment of the risks. And then there is another second bucket where the cost of adaptation is 100%, and that's your seawall example. And in those cases, yes, it's mostly a public good. It can be direct, like a seawall, or indirect, like an observation system. And governments need to create a flow of revenue, either with taxpayer money or with dedicated tools. And for instance, in cities, we have good example, for instance, in Buenos Aires, of using land value capture so that you basically make the private sector investing in buildings to also invest in flood management and capturing part of the value created through the land arrangement. if you have a place with land taxes that are based on land values, you should expect to have that already baked in, like you'll have the additional money getting in. And I see a 1 minute sign, so I get maybe stop.
Go ahead, go ahead.
So, no, just I wanted, first to thank you for reading those CCDRs. It's a lot of work. I'm always happy when somebody read them. And just to say, so I think we still have more to do in agriculture, of course, and how to incentivize more on this. One of the challenges we have in those reports is that they are country level. And you see a lot of people saying, oh, agriculture seems to be very vulnerable, so why don't we just shift away from agriculture? And of course, if everybody does that, we have a big problem. So I think my sense is today people underestimate how much of a good business agriculture will become with those threats. I mean, the demand is quite inelastic, right? So prices will go up if nothing happens. So I think we have to make that case that that at the global level, global food markets will have to feed 9 billion people. It's a huge challenge, and there will be big revenues. But I'm completely with you that this is not, I think, completely understood and taken into account. But that's something that we really push really hard in those reports to say it's not an option to get out of food production. You have to make food production more resilient and better adapted. In some places, it might be impossible. But in some places, it's an opportunity, actually, and an opportunity that is also poverty reducing. So it's a nice one. So other questions, but I'll stop here.
Let's just take this latest question, and then give you all a chance to say, either answer the question or say one more thing.
Thank you so very much. So my name is Marta. I'm from Ethiopia. So on the first study that was presented for you, I have questions on the quality of the data. Just like resilience is in the project descriptions, I wonder adaptation is being now thrown in the project descriptions and how sure you are. Because when I was presenting last year, Ethiopia getting 18% of grants for adaptation, that was refuted by the state minister. Apparently money coming to Ethiopia for post-war recovery was being recorded as grants for adaptation. So we need to be very careful, especially when we know that there is no common definition of what we're talking about, even climate change. The other is, you talked about the World Bank, the same World Bank that a study found 20% of mistagging. They were tagging incorrectly climate action. So that is another issue. I don't know. I've not read your paper, so maybe there is a caveat there. But to me, what is important is if you looked at the instrument, the quality of financing. In a study that I did in my previous life for OECD DAC reported in 2022, I found that adaptation financing to African LDCs was coming in the form of concessional loans, but 57% of the LDCs, African LDCs, in the form of concessional loans. Whether concessional or not, they have to be paid back. So you're talking about high exposure, low adaptive capacity. How about the instrument? IDA, 83% of climate action is financed by IDA in Africa. IDA charges more for climate-related projects than non-climate-related projects. So it is really important to speak about the quality. Finally, I'm sorry to take time, I just wanted to comment, and this is not your study.
Do you have a question that you want?
Yeah, I have been asking questions. So have you been looking at the quality of the data, the instrument? So those were the questions that I was raising to you. But one comment that I have, or I can phrase it as a question, is there too much expectation from the private sector when it comes to adaptation investment? Because people are talking about co-benefits, systemic changes, Does the private sector care? Does it care? The history of capitalism is violence and separating humans from nature and ecological destruction. For us to expect now the private sector to come and rescue adaptation, is it not too naive? Should we not be discussing about public resources and how to increase public resources where mitigation is being taken care of by the private sector? Thank you.
Okay, let's, this last question about private sector. Does anybody want to take that? So let's just do a round where everybody says
Yeah, I'll just make
any last comments.
one quick point probably to your question as well. And perhaps there's too much expectation for the private sector, I agree. But we did a report a few years ago on supply chains, and I think we all agree supply chains are vulnerable. What are supply chains? Transport, electricity, water, it's basically infrastructure. And then there's certainly some private facilities like warehousing and things like that. But the basic infrastructure that keeps the supply chain going is generally public. And it's going to be a long time before you get PPPs investing in transport, electrical, and water. You don't get it in this country, and you're probably not going to get it in Ethiopia. So what is my conclusion? My conclusion is the way we finance infrastructure here is not bad. That if there are bond issues that finance the infrastructure that the private sector would have a return on, but they know that it's going to something that will benefit them, that's not bad. If you have property taxes, I can't agree more. If property values go up because you've improved services, capture that positive externality, and you may end up doing it as much through public finance mechanisms as through direct investment.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, I do think that we do need, for today's problems, we can't use yesterday's solution. So I do agree with that in general. But I think there's not enough public finance in the world to address the gaps that we face in infrastructure finance, in adaptation finance. It's just not enough. So we will have to engage private sector. But, there are different types of private sector. So for example, at a recent, another convening, I was talking to some Canadians where the Canadian pension funds are investing in a high-speed rail project between, I think it's Montreal and Quebec, let's say. But basically they're investing in it because as the people of Canada use that transit system, they're literally contributing to the return on their own pension funds, right? Because it's their pension funds that are paying for it. And as they use it more, so they're actually publicizing this, saying we're using your money to use this public system, so please use the public system to get, to get your pension return. So there are ways of kind of really thinking about it, a win-win situation for everyone. Not necessarily, we're not talking about just Wall Street and so on. We're talking about how to make finance work for everyone.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, I wanted to highlight that to your point about segregating development from climate and separating, and we will keep our climate targets because they are mandated by our Board of Governors. But the important thing is that there will be no development if there is no adaptation, right? If development is not resilient, it's not development, right? And we did talk about a little bit, upon the maladaptation concept and being careful with that. And when we're talking about adaptation and the private sector, I think it's really important to recognize that there are different kinds of private sector and that it's not fair to put all the private sector in one same bucket. Small, medium enterprises are private sector. Cooperatives of smallholder farmers are private sector. Startups that are developing enabling technologies as weather forecast and ag tech monitoring, sensing systems are private sector. And then we have companies that are doing reforestation with native species in the Amazon to recover degraded lands that otherwise would generate desertification of the Amazon that would affect the whole weather system of the southern cone. That's also private sector. So I agree that we need to have like a shift in like the perpetuating the old business of private sector that doesn't take into account sustainability and long-term impacts on communities and the environment. But also try to work with these others that are making a difference and that are very needed to enable the adaptation and transform the systems that we have for future generations. So just wanted to say that.
Well, that would be a good way to finish that session, but I think I'm sorry to add then, but I completely agree with this idea that adaptation is good development. Yes, I mean, and you just have to say the opposite, and it's obvious, right? Developing in the wrong way for the climate we'll have is dumb, so we should not do dumb things. So I completely agree, and so we are development organizations. Our objectives are to support development and poverty reduction, and we're doing climate action because it's important for the development agenda. So on that, I think we're completely aligned. Then every indicator we will have will always create some issues and some confusion and some controversies. So I think what's important is to look at those indicators as like a multi-dimensional, perspective on what we're doing. And that's why I don't think we should scrap the climate finance metrics. I mean, they are a metric, it's useful, it's informative. It's not the full story, and we should complement it, and that's what we're doing, working with all of the MDBs with the outcome metrics, so that we have the two sides of the story, how much we're putting in and how much we're getting out. But the goal at the end of the day is always good development that will make people's life better. It's not a different agenda than we had in the past.
Very good. Okay, well, the only plea I would make is as you develop those metrics, please make it easier for those of us outside your institutions to get that data project by project. So that James doesn't have to go through 30 some odd projects to try to figure out what adaptation activity is being financed.
I promise we're working on making those data easier to access, including internally, because we suffer too, if that's reassuring to you.
And the one other thing I would say about the private sector is, and this is sort of a theme not just in adaptation finance, which is when should public money be used to catalyze private finance? And I just keep coming back to one principle, which is to the maximum extent possible, the benefits of that risk-sharing intervention should not be just for that transaction, but for broader transactions, so that you aren't just subsidizing one private sector actor. You have some identifiable spillover effect. That would be mine. That seems to be a broadly applicable principle. Okay, we're over time. I really commend you all for staying late on a Thursday afternoon after I'm sure you've been to dozens of meetings this week. This was a great conversation. Please join me all in thanking these panelists who I really think have done a wonderful job.